I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Lindsay Zias Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hi, friends.
Hi, welcome to Arcane Mark.
Today we are talking about side stories in your tabletop RPG.
So what do we mean when we say side stories? There's a wide variety of side stories, but basically it is anything that is off of the beaten path of the usual. PCs are following the grand arc of the main plot.
That's right. If you think about it like a season of a television show that has an ongoing arc during that season, there could be just still like Monster of the Week episodes or just a bottle episode or just some random episode that didn't necessarily advance the main plot but was also there. And that would be your side stories. They can be almost anything. They're defined more about what they are not than about what they are. And what they are not is the main campaign, something that's advancing the main campaign. So, before we get into the different ways to run side stories and the different genres and types of side story, let's ask ourselves a conceptual question. It's like, why would you want to run a side story?
One of the main reasons that you might want to do a side story is to have a break in the tone.
That's right. Well, you might have been thinking, well, these side stories could be an issue. They're going to break up momentum. They're going to cause a break in the tone. But that can actually be a good thing, especially if your campaign has gone through a few twists that are very heavy. Doing a side story that's a little lighter could lighten the mood. It can make the next heavy plot twist, like, even potentially hit harder, as opposed to just people becoming numb to it in the same way that, like, it happens in the real world too. When horrible things keep happening, you just eventually become numb to it. And so even if you're thinking that you want to have a big impact from like your very gripping drama, having a side story that lightens it up can actually increase your impact more than just be like, oh, we're back to getting beaten up again by the worst things in the world that have ever happened, continuing to happen again after time. Similarly, you can have something that's lighthearted and that you have something that's a little serious to break it up, and then it makes the lighthearted stand out more. It's contrast.
Or you can have, a campaign that is primarily social in nature that has like a more battle-y interlude, or a campaign that's more mega dungeon-y that has a more social interlude, or that kind of thing.
It gives you a breather. It gives you a breath of fresh air. So changing for change's sake is one of the reasons for a side story. In fact, it's one of the main reasons, but it's not the only reason.
Another main reason that you might want a side story is to show a different perspective or view that you can't naturally show in the context of your main campaign.
That's right. And so this may require some of the types of side stories we'll be talking about later in the episode that are not even a side quest where the normal PCs participate in the side story, but that are a side story that involves vastly different characters, but and maybe even a different time. Mm-hmm. Like maybe it was set 100 years ago, but is sort of relevant to some of the side history of the campaign. This is not the same as just running a one-shot that's just could be anything, because usually there will be some kind of tangential connection that you'll find. Either it will be the same characters doing something completely irrelevant to the main plot, or it will be different characters doing something that is somewhat relevant to the main plot in a certain way that may be found out later. Now, another reason for side stories can be not because it's something that you could never have expressed without a side story, but just because it's something that you want to take the forefront in a way that the main campaign can't. Now, when you're just writing all your own content completely, maybe the main campaign can do these kinds of side stories that you wanted to tell. Often, a side story you might want to tell is like a PC's specific arc or story.
Yes.
If you're writing it all, you could just put that in the main campaign. Like if you're Critical Role, all of those characters are going to have their important relatives and other plot lines come up while they are doing the main quest. But if you're running a Paizo adventure path and you haven't done a lot of talking to your players and major surgery in advance, which I have done in the past, chances are that it's not your players' relatives and or not your player characters' relatives and problems that are going to automatically show up in the adventure path. And if you want to include those, you're going to need to include a side story, just because that's where you're going to get that resolution. That's where you're going to advance that story. It also, even if you're coming up with your own content, maybe one of the players came up with something that was just so different than what you were doing that it didn't really make sense for it to just somehow magically become part of the main campaign, but it would make more sense for it to be a side plot.
Another reason you might want to do a side story is to temporarily make some change to the underlying assumptions that you don't want to be like a part of the main campaign.
That's true.
So, for example, you know, the PCs wind up getting sucked into another dimension and are temporarily granted grand powers while they're there, or the PCs are, you know, temporarily shrunk down to tiny size, or the PCs have some other strange thing that happens to them that you run a story where the PCs are temporarily represented by the mechanics of a different game, or some other bizarre thing that you don't want to have affecting your campaign forever because it's going to mess with your ability to tell the stories that you want to tell. But like for a little while you can.
So definitely a kind of that's odd kind of idea is something that you can do for the side stories where something's a little different, something's not the way you would normally do it in the campaign. Now, some campaigns just decide to heck with it and they do the weird thing in the campaign. And sometimes people actually are like, I don't know about that. I wish they hadn't done that in the main campaign. It's sometimes easier to do it in the side story because people can feel like the main campaign sort of sidetracked them while also sort of being the main plot in a way that they wouldn't if they knew it was a side story to begin with. So let's talk first about the simplest kind of side story. Now that we've talked about reasons why you might want to run a side story, that just is you've got all of your player characters and they're literally almost going on a side quest. Well, there is a main campaign, but this is a side quest. You see side quests everywhere. You can't get an RPG nowadays without having a whole bunch of side quests that may even be literally called side quests in a little journal that's in your entries of like all the side quests you have.
The simplest kind of side quest is the side quest where there is a thing that the PCs can achieve in the same location where they were already going for their main quest, but that causes them to approach that area in a different way.
That's right. So, for example, a side quest to like make a trade negotiation with some of the humanoid groups that live in an area that you might have otherwise attacked. Or a side quest that asks them to even just do the main quest with like an extra challenge where it's like, well, you know, yes, there's a lot of ice monsters here, but there's also a lot of fragile artwork, so please don't use area fire spells because it will destroy the mosaics.
Yeah, or like to get them to try to like get a map of the area or something like that.
Exactly.
Or to try to approach an area without being detected or that kind of thing.
Now, these are usually not what we would classify as side stories. They are a side quest, but they're not a side story.
Yes. So I wanted to start with that because my point there is that not every side quest is a side story. In order for it to be a side story, it needs to be something that is getting you to do something else that you wouldn't already be doing as a part of the main mission.
The bridge to that would be if you spent a whole session on the trade negotiations with those humanoid groups rather than just like generally doing what you would have normally done with the humanoid groups and then just, by the way, do you want to do some trade with these merchants? And they're like, okay.
Yeah.
Then it might be a side story that's about your trade negotiations. Even then, it's probably more related to the main plot than most side stories would be.
Yeah.
But that's okay. They can be organically included. As long as they're a change of pace that's doing things differently, they could classify or qualify as a side story. More likely than that, though, is that it's even just not even in the main adventure location. Like, you go off somewhere else. Or you're back in town and somebody shows up that is from your past. Or something happens. A pickpocket tries to steal from one of the PCs and fails.
Or even if, like, the town is the adventure location as a whole, then, you know, maybe it involves different characters and different...
A different district,
and
different
districts with different buildings and different objectives.
Absolutely. The key to a side story is the differences, which also help expose and emphasize the theme of the campaign. You also have to be careful about how many side stories you run. There could be a worry for some people who are like, I don't want to do any side stories because it might like de-emphasize the campaign and make the campaign blur too much. And that's usually not true, and usually you actually will help by doing just the right number of side stories. It's certainly true that if you get bloated out with side quests and side stories, and that's just like 80% of your game, then your players are going to forget the other 20% that is supposedly the main meta arc.
Yes. So you want to make sure that you're interspersing them with progress on the main arc as well. And a story that is more sandboxy is going to have a little bit more of a blurred line on like what's a side story versus a main plot. It's like, well, if your objective is explore this region, does that mean that everything is kind of the main plot?
Except for the stuff where you go back to town and you're not exploring, and then some weird thing happens. Although maybe that, which would normally be considered to be the main plot and other things, is a side story to the main plot of exploration. Like, you get to decide what is a side story and what isn't. And maybe in retrospect, you run something you expect to be a side story, and it suddenly is so interesting, everyone just gets involved in that, and now it's your main plot. That's okay. Like, if one of the PC's backstories just kind of takes over, and everybody is now only engaging with that PC's backstory for, like, an entire 5 levels of play. Like, that's possible in a game that you made yourself. If it's a Paizo AP or something like that, and you have no way to use the AP, that might not be as good of a thing.
Yeah.
But normally when you're running a home campaign, that's totally within bounds. Like, is to decide, no, this side story is more interesting, we're going to move it to the main story.
Yeah, one of the things to consider with any side story is what is the motivation of the characters to embark upon it, and what is the reward that they receive for doing it.
That's right. Especially with these side stories we're talking about that use the same characters.
So, for example, if the PCs are... And then how does that motivation reward structure compare to progressing with the main plot? Because if the PCs are much more rewarded by doing these random side things, then they're more likely to proceed with that instead of going back to the main plot. You don't want to be in a situation where the thing that is the most rewarding for the characters in terms of resources is like grindy or not as interesting. You want to make sure that the main plot stays compelling too.
Also, in general, with side stories, not only is that true, and also some groups, like, literally the motivation they need is, it was there. I want to do everything.
Yeah.
But it's actually even more important that the side stories be interesting and not grindy. Yes. Now, not to say, oh yeah, you should totally make your main campaign uninteresting and grindy. Obviously, you don't want to do that either. But for a side story to earn its place, it needs to be effective. It needs to do what it's supposed to do concisely and effectively and provide that feeling. Whereas for the main campaign, like, okay.
You can be like, okay, yeah, maybe that wasn't the world's most interesting dungeon, but we did defeat one of the lieutenants of the major villain, and now we're moving on with the story. That's correct. Whereas if it was like a random thing they found, it was like, oh, that wasn't the most interesting dungeon.
Why do we even do this?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
You don't want the characters after the fact being like, why do we do this? Or like, this wasn't worth our time.
Or getting bored partway through.
Yeah, and you definitely don't want the players getting bored of
or the characters.
Or the characters, yeah, either way.
Partway through and just being like, I as a player like these battles, but my character doesn't know why we're here and is bored.
One of the things that works well with side stories then is that because they are less load bearing, working with the players to figure out what kinds of side stories interest them. You can drop hooks for a lot of potential side stories, see what they bite on, and then build out those and other similar ideas.
That's right. You're also much more easily able to go with something that's very different or a little bit riskier than you would in a main campaign. This is especially true if you're running a side story that is a vignette that is not about the normal characters. So let's move over into vignette side stories. So a vignette side story is one where you're playing some of the NPCs you may have seen before, or historical figures, maybe even the bad guys that you've come across in the past or somewhere around the present, to get a different sort of perspective of what's going on in the campaign.
Now, if this is a story that takes place canonically in the past of your campaign, there are a few things that you'll want to watch for to make sure that you don't run into chronological contradictions. Like, if you were telling a story about how the villain did something in the past, and then, like, the end result of that is that the villain in their group died in the past, and, like, that could be a serious problem for your campaign. So
if one of your players is like, we're in the past, well, I am going to tell the Illuminati to send some valuable coins to David Xanatos in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And that way I can convince my father that I'm a self-made man or something like that.
So one of the things, it's like how...
It's like, no, you want to make sure your players have buy-off that they're not literally trying to create a temporal paradox by playing this.
But on the other hand, some folks don't like prequels as much because they're like, well, this is a prequel, I know where it's going to end. So it's best to choose something where the players playing through it will be, in their results, will be able to change something about history. Like maybe there's a difference in how something turns out. Maybe you're not playing like the villain necessarily, but you're playing like a group of people who are part of the villain's organization. And then, if that group survives, then they may wind up getting better loot. And then by the time the players fight them, and then being around to being some of the people that the PCs fight against, they could potentially negotiate with.
Not that you've ever done that before, Linda.
Yes. So you can do something like that where it intersects in that way, but it does matter one way or the other to the story, how the PCs did, or how did they succeed. Like, if okay, well, one way or the other, the Rose Diamond was stolen, but was it this group or was it another group?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for the status of various factions?
Or you come into a ruins and are like, how did this ruins get like this? And then you have like a flashback scene of the ruins. Maybe the PCs even saw them as visions. And but you as the GM aren't exactly sure. Because you're willing to let the vignette side story be the one that told the tale.
And the story, and as long as the pieces that you know for sure are things that are definitely going to happen, like, that, like, a meteor is going to fall and hit this area.
And that's just gonna happen.
But, like, but what's unclear is, like, did this particular group of people survive, and what does it mean whether they survived or not?
Did these people kill the T-Rex before the meteor fell, or were they eaten by the T-Rex and then the meteor fell?
So if you can show them, like, just enough to be the things that are like, all right, there's no way they can, like, actually stop this particular piece of it from happening. I mean, you always have to be careful with there's no way, but still... it seems highly unlikely they'll be able to stop this particular piece of it from happening, and then you can go in and figure out based on what they do what is the canonical truth.
So when it comes to these side stories, we already said you can break what you would almost never normally do and run them with different characters.
There's another thing that you can do with that too, is that there's that whole thing that you see a lot in tabletop RPGs where it's like some scholars say this and some scholars say that. You can have sort of like some scholars say X, Y, or Z type situation, and then the PCs, it's like, all right, what actually happened? And then their results are what determine what's true.
Mm-hmm. So we've already talked about the fact you can change the time, you can change the location, you can even change the characters. Mm-hmm. You can change more than that with side stories.
Yes.
You can run a side story that is literally not even in the same RPG system.
Yes.
As the main campaign. Like, imagine that your PCs are, like, they're a hack and slash group that is, like, going through dungeons, and then, like, I don't know, they find some kind of valuable but dangerous item, and an evil noble who wants to use the item for bad means, like, arrests them unfairly, throws them in jail, and then takes the item. And then you run a Blades in the Dark session. It's a side story about the group heisting their way out of jail, stealing the artifact back using Blades in the Dark versions of the characters. That could even be part of the main campaign in the way that I just discussed it, unless we were saying that item was actually not part of the main campaign. It was just a throwaway the GM put in that the players got really attached to, and so you came up with this side story about the evil noble arresting you under false charges so you could do a little random heist in Blades in the Dark. Like, you can literally run it in a different system if you have a system that works really well for the side story. And it still works. Mm-hmm. In fact, it gives you your change of pace.
Yeah. Now, if you are using a different system and the two systems don't match up in terms of, like, difficulty and consequences, then you'll need to work with the players to figure out how that works out. Like,
that's a big problem with subsystems within even a normal.
Like, if you're playing like a light and fluffy game, and then suddenly you're playing a game that has all sorts of nasty permanent consequences, then you come back. We talk about it like
you were like playing Toon, and it was like, nothing can happen to your Toon, and it's like, now we're playing Blades in the Dark, and my Toon is like addicted to narcotics and owes a massive debt to these other people and is like completely going to be removed from the campaign because of like mental scars from getting too overly stressed. And it's like, what just happened?
Yeah. So, this is something we can actually get into somewhat more in what looks like it's probably going to be our episode coming up soon, based on some of the votes on mindscapes and metaphors, where you start to get into some of the ways to handle this kind of thing. But I guess, some of it can be like temporary effects if you want to have that and you kind of just snap out of it, or you change what the consequence conditions are, even though you're using the same game. You're like, all right, yeah, well, we're not playing this game overall, so like the long-term consequences here are not something that we're dealing with. We're just dealing with these particular parts of the system.
You have to think about it though, because you will potentially have people to get upset if you're using a different system, and so what worked for their character doesn't work anymore.
Yes.
For example, one of the things that made people the angriest of any subsystem in Pathfinder 1 was the mass combat subsystem. This is because the actual combat subsystem in Pathfinder 1 was so, broken in terms of how strong you could be compared to how strong they thought you would be if you didn't have a GM who altered the opponents, that you could easily make a character who could definitely have won a fight against 10,000 people who were all 10 levels higher than them. Yep. No question. Okay, sure, you could roll all natural ones in a row. They could just roll 20s. They could roll 20 20s in a row for all 10,000 of them, and that is less likely than the probability of one atom out of the entire universe being the atom that we selected. But you could build a character that was basically guaranteed to win against 10,000 people 10 levels higher than them. But would lose in a mass combat because the mass combat system was not stacked in their favor in that way. It'd be like, well, once I add to my PC, an army,
then suddenly
I can now not even beat something that's my same level sometimes because it's no longer stacked in my favor in the same way. It's like, that doesn't make sense. Can I just leave my army and fight the 10,000 people using regular combat? Because I would win. I can prove it. And this can be an issue for you when you want to tell a side story that uses a different system. So you want to make sure, even if the consequences are different, that's something like Linda said, you can figure it out. But if the scope of the amount that the system is kind of broken in favor of the PCs is very different.
Well, even if it's not a power level thing, if it's like that they can't necessarily do their shtick. Like if you have someone who's like, oh, my character is an alchemist who has is always gonna have just the right thing on hand, and then they're playing a system that doesn't have as much equipment. It's like, well, wait a minute, how do I represent this kind of thing? If it's something that for other players, if it's something that they can't tell a cohesive through line that explains what their character would do.
Yep, it just depends also on the player what they are gonna feel. I've definitely seen people who got upset because their character was no longer as effective in just some subsystem version or when they got converted. I've also seen people, and I've been one myself, who I understand if the adventure doesn't have something for me, or who just gets chuckles when the adventure does. With that alchemist example, I remember when we were playing, some of the people at Paizo were playing Aegon, and I just made a character who was a potion maker just because I felt like it. And you're supposed to make a title, and I took the title Polypharmacos, which means able to make any potion. Which I assumed was going to be useless. I was like, how often is that going to actually matter in any of these ancient Greek adventures? But apparently the pre-gen adventure was entirely about alchemy and poisoning, and people had been doped up, and I was just like, what? I didn't even expect this. I made this expecting that I would be useless with this ability, or I would have to really think hard and use it every once in a while. But did the GM laugh when they saw your character sheet? Need. Well, first, Jason was running, and first he was like, "What is this title?" And I explained it. He was like, "Okay." He didn't give away. He kept a poker face. He didn't give away that was entirely what the adventure was about, but he didn't try to dissuade me from picking it as a title either. And it was like, wow, that is literally what this is about. Then I guess that was a surprise. But I wouldn't have been upset if my character couldn't do any of my alchemy because it was like fighting minotaurs in a maze or something like that. Minotauriarty. So the point is that this shows that you need to, as always, discuss with your players. Make sure you know the social contract. Don't just ambush your players by saying, and now you're in jail. Ready? It's time for Blades in the Dark. And then you just pull it out and they're like, what? Like, don't just ambush them in the middle of the session with no expectations or understanding. Be like, okay, so I remember you guys were really interested in these conspiracy theories about this item, and you thought that Noble What's-Her-Name really wants it. So I was thinking of a plot line where Noble What's-Her-Name takes the item, and then you have to do a heist using Blades in the Dark. What do you guys think? And see what they say. And if they're like, no. This is not Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons, therefore it does not exist in my mind, and we will never play it again, sweet cape. Then you probably shouldn't do it.
Well, another option for those too is that it's easier if the story that you're telling is not directly the PCs who people are very attached to, and everything in those needs to be converted. So it's like, all right, maybe you can represent something that's going on with some NPCs in that way.
Maybe Noble What's-Her-Name takes the item and you guys have lost track of it, but a friendly group of thieves that you befriended a few sessions ago is going to go on a heist to get it back for you because they heard that you guys were in a pinch. And you're playing those guys.
Another thing that you can achieve with other groups is that aren't the PCs is doing something that is notably higher or lower level than the PCs. If you get to high levels and you want to go back and have a little bit of adventuring, it can be really fun to be like, this is an adventure of like some of the people that the PCs have been mentoring going out, and then they can talk about like, oh man, I learned this from the great Archer Foch or whatever, and talk about the PCs in that way. I know that I've found that players really enjoy playing NPCs gossiping about their characters, especially if they have opinions that are not universally positive about their characters. And yeah, so that can be a lot of fun. You can also do it the other way around, where if your campaign is somewhat lower level, then you're doing something that's at like a higher power level. You want to make sure in that case that your players have some time to get to know that higher power level if they've never played at it. Like, you're not going to want to be like, oh, hello, new player, it's your third session. We've been playing first level characters, but now here, let's play 16th level. Like, you want to give them time to grok it. Because one of the things that we definitely see with making adventures with, like, pre-generated characters and things like that is that the higher level the character, the more time it takes to build something that's going to make sense for the story. And that gets me into another thing about like pre-generated characters. They're definitely something you might want to consider for side stories if you want to have specific characters who have specific roles. You can let the players know, hey, this is this character, here's their build, and like here's a few things about them. And then later on, if they show up in the main story, then it's consistent. Maybe it's them, but they're 4 levels higher because this was what they were like 5 years ago, but the PCs will be, the players will be like, oh yeah, I recognize that person, and then...
Yep. And it's especially useful if it's like already is actually someone that they know. So it's like, yeah, the person you were playing turned out to be that masked sword fighter that you already had seen before we did the side story, and now the mask is revealed, and it is your pre-gen that you were playing.
Oh yeah, like Mark did that with me once, and there was like a young soldier who was called like Kid, always called like Kid or something like that. And like they never used his actual name. In a side story. And then it was like revealed to be one of the primary like adversaries that I had been playing when he was early in his career as a soldier.
Yep, Linda was playing as the like commanding officer of a character who eventually became a commander in a group that was hunting witches, and Linda's character was a witch.
Yes. So my main character was a witch, so it was like, oh yeah, that character, that was totally him. Yeah, his personality was similar. Oh my god. But I just didn't think about it because I was so used to thinking about the characters like the terrifying mastermind general.
Rather than like the like teenage boy who had lost his previous commander to a giant witch attack. And was now trying to pick up the pieces by working in a different organization.
Yes.
Yep.
That was very effective when you're like, by the way, that was him. Like, oh my god, really?
Yep. So that is a way that you can get things to work really well for side stories if they actually were somewhat all along, but they didn't realize it until afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, the way that people are referred to can change, especially if they're in like a very different context from what the players are used to.
Mm-hmm.
You could also potentially go back in time with the player characters and do something from earlier on.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
You know, you might do something where it's like, okay, yeah, you know, your adventure was a higher level adventure and it started at 5th level or whatever. Sort of like if you have a story that starts kind of in media race and then you go back and are like, so how did you all meet in the first place?
Like that side story that Linda was talking about, it also had other connections. Like there's a NPC who was really afraid of the Tooth Fairy, and Linda found out that the Tooth Fairy had killed the mother of that NPC.
Yep. Fairies are serious business in that campaign.
Mm-hmm. They certainly are. So basically the idea with side stories is, to summarize, you're making a change, you're doing something different, you're shaking things up. What makes it a side story is its definition of being different than the main campaign, even though it could become the main campaign if it gets more popular with your group or you decide that that's the direction you want to go. Especially if it's not like a pre-published adventure where you have to toss out the rest of the adventure to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, it's something that is like a palate cleanser, a change of pace.
Now, if you are doing a campaign that has a lot of side stories, you might consider making some alterations to the structure of your XP or treasure and talking to your players about that up front so that you make sure that you're not going to over-level them for the main campaign, particularly if you're doing something that has a more fixed main campaign like an adventure path. Like I've typically used the slow XP structure for a lot of my campaigns so that I have more room to say, hey, okay, we're gonna have the space to not have you guys get super over leveled. And then sometimes I've still needed to go back and adjust, but like if you talk to them up front and be like, hey, you know, I want to put more content in here, but to make sure that we don't level up too fast, let's have these things do whatever. And then you can adjust the treasure accordingly too, or you cannot adjust the treasure accordingly and you can just let the players be a little wealthier. It's not going to break anything.
It should be fine. It depends on what system you're playing. But in Pathfinder 2, it's an exponential curve, so you should be fine if they get a little bit more right now, because before long, it won't make too much of a difference. That's some of the benefit of the smoothing from the exponential.
Yeah, and another thing you can look to do is look at rewards that are not XP and treasure necessarily, that are in terms of, like, reputation or access or, you know, other things like that, or like if you or progress toward the goals of the characters.
Yep, more horizontal than vertical power.
Yes.
Absolutely. So always be thinking about those things like rewards, how the side stories might tie into future side stories, or maybe back to the main campaign in certain ways. Usually a small callback rather than like becoming the main campaign, but you never know. And if you do that, if you have an idea of why you want to run the side story, you have an idea of what the side story will accomplish, and you have a strong sort of basic concept for the side story itself, then you're going to have a very effective side story that's probably going to strengthen your campaign.
Now, it is possible with side stories that you may have one of these things that appeals to the majority of your players, but not all. And it's completely legitimate to say, oh yeah, you know, if we're telling the story that is related to like the backstory of this character and these other things and things like that, and then like one person's not available and they weren't really interested, then you can move forward with it. Side stories can also be a way to help in that case with like players being unavailable, and you can still move things forward without having the pressure of like this is the main plot.
That's right. So there's even a logistical reason that you might use a side story, which can be similar to using a one-shot or a different campaign, but it's a way to continue with something that's connected to the campaign. So does anyone in chat have any questions about the use of side stories, or a way that you want to see us talk to you about side stories? It doesn't look like it to me. It looks like people have mostly been listening and on this topic. So I think that we can say goodbye to YouTube. What do you think,
Yes,
Linda?
let's.
All right. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye!